What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel and my review of Big Blue. So I've had this cabinet for a few days now, and I wanted to give you just my overall impressions of my experience with the cabinet so far. Now, whether intentional or not, this has become one of Arcade1up's most highly anticipated cabinets. And with all the design changes, there's a lot of questions that involve more than just gameplay. So I wanted to kind of start out with going over the assembly process, how did that go, and then we're going to get into the good and the bad, and whether I'm going to be able to recommend this cabinet or not. So obviously, by looking at the cabinet, you can tell the design is a radical departure from anything we've seen from Arcade1up so far, and of course, that's going to necessitate some changes in the assembly. The assembly process is different, but yet familiar. Things go together roughly in the same order that they do before, except you're obviously going to have a lot more parts. With those extension pieces on the side, raising that side panel up, you've got a few more pieces that I expected, and then some that I didn't. I knew that you would probably have two pieces stacked on top of each other, so that would kind of necessitate some dowels and maybe even some additional hardware, but I didn't know that they were going to actually include these metal plates on either side to really stiffen that up, so I think that's a good thing. Now, of course, those wooden dowels and metal plates don't give the side structure all the rigidity that it needs. That really comes from those additional cross braces on the inside. The speaker support panel is now made up of 3 individual pieces with extra angle brackets and, of course, more hardware, more wooden dowels, etc. And while that may seem like overkill, it actually gives a lot more structure to that and adds some rigidity for the dreaded step 12. Putting that second side panel on is made much more complex with all these additional parts and support panels and pieces. The only thing that was really a problem, though, was the LED support panel on the inside, the one that actually houses the LED strip. Because it's just sort of sitting in there and it's not fastened from the bottom, because you do that once you stand the cabinet up, it tends to flop around. Everything else seems to be rigid enough to where you can sort of start at the top with your side panel and then work your way down. I thought I was going to lose my mind, but it ended up being okay. It wasn't as difficult as I think the Legacy cab was. Now, with all that complexity and the differences in the design, one thing that has made a return from the 3rd generation is the way you insert your J and I panels. I love that. The fact that they just slide into those routed grooves makes that part really simple. It's one less thing you have to line up when you sandwich those 2 side panels together. And then when it comes down to the stool and the riser, that assembly is exactly the way that it has been on every other generation. And before I move on from the assembly, we got to talk about that PCB. This latest version of the Arcade1up PCB is really like an evolution. Features and ports don't seem to disappear, they just seem to be added, and they continue to add more ports. And it really makes you wonder, why? Everything still remains from your Legacy cabinet with an addition of an Ethernet port and also the micro SD card slot from the countercades. And I would consider that Ethernet port a requirement if you're going to talk about the online gaming function and reducing that latency. That way when you lose, you really don't have any excuses. And now let's take a quick look at all the adjustable settings for each game. All right, so let's talk about the good. And the first thing is going to be viewing the screen is completely 100% unobstructed. I don't know if there's been a resolution increase or it's just sort of the nature of the colors that are used in a Capcom game versus a Midway game, but it just seems brighter. And I know that the menu, the interface, selecting different games, moving back and forth is just so much smoother. It's not clunky. And I thought that the interface on the Legacy cabinets was pretty good. This is actually a step above. And I'm so happy to see the control panel width return to that 19-inch dimension that we saw on the 3rd generation cabinets. Now, in my opinion, that 19-inch width is just a minimum. It should never get any more narrow than that. And the fact that we're mounting it into the side panels directly means that the screw heads themselves have also been moved out a ½ inch. Another thing that's kind of a welcome feature that I didn't really realize was a feature is the fact that the live button now functions as a back button. So before, if you wanted to exit a game, you'd have to hold down the player 1 button for 3 to 5 seconds, and then it would prompt you to either leave or continue, and the live button just sort of deletes that 3 to 5 second hold. And the last thing on the good list is going to be, believe it or not, the way the cabinet looks. I think it goes without saying that those early renderings of this cabinet were not flattering at all. All right, now let's talk about the bad, and while that list is short, I think some of the items on here could be detrimental to the success of this cabinet. All right, so number 1 on the naughty list is going to be the fact that the marquee looks pretty washed out. And I know you can blame some of this on the graphic. I know I had the same issue with my first generation lit marquee. It was kind of dull, but I think that for the most part, they've lightened up the color on this, so it should be much more vibrant. In fact, it's on right now, and you can barely tell. Now, when the lights go out, it's not that big of a deal, but it is something to take note of. I think that with the size of that marquee, you definitely could have had more than just one row of LEDs. All right, so number 2 is the overall height of the control deck itself. Obviously, not the top of the cabinet, but where you actually place your hands. Now, this problem is uniform across all Arcade1up products, so more than likely you have a solution already if you own more than one of these cabinets. Okay, let's talk about the headphone jack. And there's 2 main issues with it. One's quality and one is placement. It's far too difficult to get a good connection. And of course, when you lose that connection, the audio leaves your headphones and goes back to the speakers. So it kind of goes back and forth. So once you get that connection and position just right, then you have another problem. The fact that it's just a few inches above your hand. So the cable or the cord that you're using is going to have to be draped to the left or to the right. The best solution I found is that actually just draping it over that second player joystick is fine. It keeps it out of my way. But what happens when you have a second player? And of course, you can make the argument that if you're going to have 2 players, you're not going to have your headphones in, but that's not necessarily the case. I could see a scenario where you would actually just plug in a splitter, and then both of you would have a set of headphones on. It's probably not going to happen that often, but it's still an issue. And it makes me appreciate where we're going to have that connection on the 2-player countercades off to one side. That really kind of makes a whole lot more sense. Okay, so the last, but probably the biggest bad of them all, is the angle on the control panel. So as a point of comparison, the Golden Tee control panel is angled 9 degrees, while Big Blue is angled at 15. So when you couple that angle with the fact that these cabinets are very low without an additional riser, for someone who's 6'1", it makes this cabinet unplayable. And that's not an exaggeration. Now, all my cabinets are raised 4 inches to accommodate me and my freakish height, so it really wasn't that big of an issue for me, but it still leads to some discomfort after long gaming sessions. Okay, so there's the good, there's the bad. Last question to answer is, do I recommend this cabinet? Well, let me put it to you this way. You know, after I put this thing together and got it in place next to the Midway Legacy, next to the Golden Axe, and I sort of walked and stepped back and looked at the entire wall, I couldn't help but laugh. But I wasn't laughing at the cabinet. I was laughing at the fact that it just looks like a giant middle finger. And I love that. You know, arcade cabinets back in the day were more than just there to play games. They were also in competition of other games inside that same arcade. So they were always trying to one-up each other with, you know, some big, audacious, bombastic design. And if you're gonna have an arcade at home, uniformity is really not something you want to strive for. And if you've watched some of my other videos, that may seem a little bit contradictory because I like that 3rd generation style of Arcade1up. And I think that if they maintain that, I don't think I would have a problem with it. But seeing this, and this diversity, and this wild craziness, that's part of the arcade experience. So to have these crazy looks, to have these crazy designs, nothing's gonna be perfect. And I think that if you can, you know, elevate the cabinet to alleviate some of the wrist pain that you might suffer by playing some of these games, and the fact that it just looks so damn cool, I gotta recommend it. But of course, at the end of the day, it is your decision to make, so I would caution you about some of the design issues. Bear in mind, you're gonna have to raise this thing up to make it playable. Really consider that games list. If you're not jazzed about those games, you might wanna pass and just go with, go with a Capcom Legacy. Because I gotta say, while, you know, Knights of the Round is cool, I really miss Final Fight. I hope this review does help you make that decision. Thank you so much for stopping by. Y'all have a blessed day, and I will see you next time.